Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
When I was around 12 or 13 years old, I stayed up late one weekend with two of my sisters. I have 5 siblings, so our house was usually busy and noisy. It was either a Friday or Saturday night, which meant none of us were worried about getting up early for school the next morning. At first, the evening felt normal. My sisters and I were talking, watching television, and enjoying the extra freedom of being allowed to stay awake. My older brother was stretched out on the couch and had fallen into a deep sleep. My father was still finishing some work before bed. The only thing that felt unusual was my mother. At some point that evening, we noticed she had been crying. She tried to hide it, but it was obvious something had upset her. My sisters and I asked what was wrong. She would not explain. She only said, "This day holds bad memories." That answer made us curious, but we could tell she did not want to talk about it. We assumed it was connected to something private from her past. Maybe someone had died on that date. Maybe something had happened in the family that she did not want to discuss with children. We stopped asking. The words stayed in the back of my mind, though. This day holds bad memories. At the time, I did not understand what she meant. Later, those words would become one of the most disturbing parts of the night. Around 11 o'clock, my father began getting ready for bed. He was putting away his work and checking that everything in the house was secure. Then we heard noises coming from the garage. It sounded as though someone was moving things. There were faint scrapes, taps, and heavier sounds from behind the door. The noises were not constant, but they were clear enough that several of us noticed them. Our first thought was my older brother. He often worked on projects in the garage. He liked taking things apart, building things, and tinkering with tools. It would not have been unusual for him to be out there late, searching for something or finishing an idea. Then we looked toward the couch. He was asleep. He was not pretending to rest or lying there with his eyes partly open. He was completely out. That left the possibility of an animal. Raccoons sometimes entered garages, sheds, and bins looking for food. They could knock over containers or drag objects around. A raccoon trapped inside would make exactly the kind of sounds we were hearing. My father decided to investigate. Because we did not know whether the noise came from an animal or a person, he took a shotgun with him. One of my sisters grabbed a baseball bat. I took a broom. Looking back, the broom would not have offered much protection against a burglar or angry raccoon, but it was the closest thing I could find. The 3 of us approached the garage door. My father opened it first. The garage was completely dark. For a second, we stood at the entrance, listening. The noises had stopped. My father reached for the switch and turned on the light. The room appeared empty. The family car was parked inside. My older brother's projects were spread across the work area, along with tools, parts, boxes, and other things collected over time. Nothing immediately looked disturbed. There was no raccoon hiding beside the bins. No person stood behind the car. No tools were rolling across the floor. My father searched carefully. He looked around the sides of the vehicle and checked the darker corners. We searched behind containers and anywhere a small animal might hide. We did not find anything. The garage door was closed, and there was no obvious sign that an animal had forced its way inside. My father probably decided that the sounds came from objects settling or something shifting naturally. Garages are full of metal, wood, and tools that react to temperature changes. A loose object can slide after sitting still for hours. Something resting against a wall can fall without warning. A small animal may also enter and escape through an opening too narrow for us to notice. After several minutes, my father returned inside. He had work to finish and did not believe there was any danger. My sister and I stayed behind. She had become interested in some of our older brother's projects. Since the lights were on and our father had searched the room, the garage no longer felt dangerous. I began explaining some of the things our brother was working on. I do not remember exactly what the projects were. There may have been mechanical parts, electronics, or pieces of equipment arranged near the workbench. My sister looked over them with mild interest while I told her what I understood. For a short time, everything was normal again. Then I felt as though someone was watching me. The feeling came suddenly. There was no new sound and no voice from behind us. I simply became aware of a presence in the garage. The back of my neck tightened, and I felt an urgent need to turn around. At almost the exact same moment, my sister spun around too. Neither of us told the other to look. We both moved instinctively, raising the objects we were holding. She still had the bat. I held the broom in front of me. We faced the area in front of the parked car. A dark figure was there. I could not see a face, clothes, or any normal details. It appeared only as a silhouette. The shape looked roughly human, but something about its position was wrong. It did not seem to be standing on the floor. It looked as though it was floating slightly above the ground or hanging from something we could not see. The body seemed long and still. It did not wave, step forward, or speak. It only faced us. The garage light was on, so it should have been possible to see more. There should have been color, shadows, or some visible surface reflecting the light. Instead, the figure looked unnaturally dark. It was darker than the wall and the objects around it, like a person's shaped section of shadow placed into a bright room. My sister saw it too. That was clear from the way she reacted. She did not ask what I was looking at. She stared directly toward the same place, holding the bat as though she expected the figure to move. For a second, neither of us spoke. The figure remained in front of the car. The longer I looked, the more its strange position disturbed me. It was too high to be standing normally. Its feet did not appear planted on the floor. The body looked suspended. Then my sister screamed. The instant she did, the silhouette vanished. I did not see it walk away. It did not move behind the car or fade slowly. One moment, the shape was there. The next, the space in front of the car was empty. My sister's scream brought everyone running. My father came back with my mother, and my older brother woke on the couch and rushed into the garage. We tried to explain what we had seen. We told them that a dark figure had been standing or hanging in front of the car. We said it disappeared when my sister screamed. The adults looked around again. There was nobody inside. No intruder was hiding behind the vehicle. Nothing hung from the ceiling. There was no object in front of the car that obviously resembled a person. My parents told us we had probably seen a reflection on one of the car windows. That explanation was reasonable. The garage contained several light sources and reflective surfaces. A person moving near the doorway could create a dark shape on the car. The windows might reflect one of us, a hanging coat, a tool, or something outside the room. If my sister and I moved at the same time, the reflection could disappear instantly. The shape may have seemed suspended because it was visible on glass rather than standing on the floor. At our age, fear and expectation could easily turn a reflection into a human figure. We had already heard unexplained sounds. We had entered carrying weapons. Our bodies were prepared to see a threat. When I suddenly turned, my sister may have copied me. We could both have focused on the same reflection and interpreted it as a person. Then, when she screamed and moved, the angle changed and the image vanished. That may be exactly what happened. But I remember the figure as being in front of the car, not only on the window. It seemed to occupy the room. It had depth. I could see the shape of a body hanging in the open space. My sister remembered it the same way. We did not argue with our parents for long. There was nothing left to show them. The figure was gone, and the garage looked completely normal. Eventually, everyone returned inside. The night continued, but I did not forget what I had seen. For years, I treated the event as a strange childhood experience. It was frightening, but nothing else happened afterward that I could clearly connect to it. We did not repeatedly see the figure in the garage. No one found signs of a person living inside the house. There were no ropes hanging from the ceiling and no footprints around the car. The noises that brought us into the garage could have been ordinary. The silhouette could have been a reflection. That was the explanation I tried to accept. Then, years later, my sister and I learned why our mother had been crying that night. The date held bad memories because it was the anniversary of our great-uncle's death. More than 40 years earlier, he had taken his own life by hanging himself. The family had not spoken openly about it when we were children. Our mother knew the date, and every year it brought back the memory. That alone explained her sadness. What disturbed us was the location. Our great-uncle had died in the same place where we saw the hanging silhouette. The area in front of the car was where his body had been found. I remember the physical chill that came over me when I understood the connection. Until then, the figure had been only a dark shape. Once we learned the family history, its position made terrible sense. It had looked as though it was floating or hanging because that was what had happened there decades before. My sister and I had not known. Our mother never told us before that night. No one had described how our great-uncle died or shown us the exact place. We were too young, and the subject was painful. That meant the image had not come from a story planted in our minds. At least, that is how it seemed. We had seen a suspended figure in the same spot without knowing the history. The coincidence felt too precise. I began replaying the entire evening, my mother crying, her refusal to explain. This day holds bad memories. The noises from the garage around 11, my sleeping brother, the empty search, the feeling of being watched. My sister and I turning at the same time, the black silhouette hanging in front of the car. Then the scream and disappearance. The events suddenly formed a single story. Perhaps the anniversary brought something back. Maybe the noises were the first sign. Perhaps the figure appeared because two children had entered the exact place where a family member died. That was the supernatural explanation, and for a long time, it frightened me. But learning the history may also have changed the memory. Before we knew about our great-uncle, we described the figure as floating or hanging from something. After learning how he died, that part became more important. The connection may have sharpened details that were originally uncertain. Memory is not a recording. Every time we remember an event, we rebuild it. New information can enter the old image without us realizing it. A shadow that looked slightly above the floor might later become a clearly hanging body, because that interpretation now fits. The figure may also have been a reflection from the car. The shape of one of us, distorted across curved glass, could appear long and suspended. The garage light might cast shadows from tools or objects hanging overhead. If something swung slightly when the door opened, both of us could see it move and feel watched. When my sister screamed, one of us shifted, causing the shadow to disappear. Shared misinterpretation remains possible. My sister and I were looking from nearly the same place. We were both frightened by the noises and carrying objects for protection. If the garage contained a human-shaped reflection, both of us would see it. The feeling of being watched may have come from a small sound behind us. I turned first, and she reacted to my movement so quickly that it felt simultaneous. Or she may have turned first, causing me to do the same. Over time, we remembered ourselves spinning together because that made the event feel more powerful. There is no way to test the exact timing now. The figure may even have been our older brother. He had been asleep on the couch when we first checked, but he could have awakened and entered quietly. The garage door connecting to the house may have allowed him to stand near the car and frighten us. When my sister screamed, he could have ducked or moved behind the vehicle. However, he came running with our parents afterward and appeared confused. He never admitted to a prank. There also did not seem to be enough time for him to move from the garage, return to the house, and arrive with everyone without being noticed. One of our parents could have cast a shadow from the doorway while checking on us, but they had gone back inside and only returned after the scream. A reflection from outside is another possibility. Headlights from a passing car could project a human-shaped shadow through a window. A tree branch, post, or object outside might appear across the garage wall or vehicle. As the car passed, the image would vanish suddenly. The noises and our fear made us interpret the moving shadow as a person. That would explain why it appeared only briefly and left no physical evidence. Yet the figure did not seem to move across the room like headlights. It remained still long enough for both of us to stare. It faced us. It seemed aware. That feeling may have come from the shape having something like a head. Human brains are extremely sensitive to faces and bodies. We see people in coats, curtains, shadows, and furniture, because identifying another person quickly is important for survival. A vague oval above a dark vertical form becomes a head and torso. Once the pattern is recognized, the figure seems to look directly at us. The car itself could have produced the whole image. The windshield, mirrors, doors, and hanging seat belts create shapes that change depending on the angle. A dark reflection of the open doorway might look like a tall body. The bumper or lower frame could hide the bottom, creating the impression that it floated. This remains the most reasonable explanation. But the exact location of our great-uncle's death prevents the memory from feeling ordinary. Between the ages of 14 and 16, I sometimes heard footsteps outside my bedroom window at night. They were not soft sounds that could easily be mistaken for an animal or a branch moving in the wind. They sounded like heavy boots walking slowly across gravel. Step, 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 the sound was clear enough that I could picture a person moving through our backyard. I slept with my bedroom window open, even during winter, so there was very little between me and whatever was making the noise. The cold air came directly into the room, along with every sound from outside. I knew what our backyard normally sounded like. I knew the quiet movement of leaves, the scratching of small animals, the wind passing through branches, and the occasional creak from the fence. These footsteps were different. They had weight behind them. Each step pressed into the gravel with the unmistakable crunch of someone wearing boots. The first time I heard them, I froze in bed. I was not a small child by then. I was old enough to understand that houses make sounds and that animals move through gardens at night. I did not immediately imagine a ghost or monster. My first thought was that a person had entered our backyard. That possibility was worse than anything supernatural. A ghost might disappear. A real person could be looking for a way into the house. I lay completely still, listening. The footsteps moved somewhere beyond the open window. I could not tell exactly how close they were, because darkness changes the way sound travels. Sometimes they seemed directly below the window. Other times they sounded farther away near the edge of the garden. I did not hear anyone speaking. There was no quiet conversation between two people or the sound of someone calling for a pet. Only the boots. The person seemed to walk slowly enough that they were not trying to escape quickly. That made me feel as though they believed they had time. They were not running through the property after taking a shortcut. They were moving around. Maybe they were looking at the windows. Maybe they were checking doors. Perhaps they were only standing in the darkness and shifting their weight. I did not know. My body reacted before I could decide what to do. I became so frightened that I could barely move. It felt as though every muscle had locked into place. I wanted to get out of bed and close the window, but that would require approaching the sound. The window was open only a few feet away. If a person stood beneath it, moving the curtains or touching the frame might tell them exactly where I was. I also did not want to look outside. People often say that they would immediately check a strange sound, but it is different when you are lying in a dark room and believe someone is on the other side of an open window. Looking would mean placing my face close to the glass. If someone was there, they might already be looking back. I stayed still and listened until I could no longer hear the footsteps. Even after they stopped, I did not feel safe. Silence did not mean the person had left. They might have stopped walking because they reached the house. They could be standing directly beneath the window, waiting for movement inside. Eventually, I forced myself out of bed. I moved slowly, trying not to make the floor creak. I left my room and crept toward my mother's bedroom. By then, I was so frightened that I could barely speak. I leaned close to her and whispered, "Mom, there's someone in our backyard." The words were difficult to get out. My throat felt tight, and I did not want to raise my voice in case the person outside could hear us through my open window. My mother got up. She took a torch and went outside to check. I stayed inside while she searched the garden. Part of me expected her to shout that she had found someone. Another part feared that the person might be hiding and would attack her. I remember listening for movement, trying to work out where she was from the sound of the door and her footsteps. She came back without finding anyone. She told me I must have been dreaming, or that I had heard the trees rustling. I tried to explain that I was awake. I knew what footsteps sounded like. Trees do not walk slowly across gravel in heavy boots. Wind creates irregular noises. It makes leaves scrape, branches knock, and fences move. It does not create the steady rhythm of a person taking one step after another. My mother did not believe that anyone had been there. She had gone outside with the torch and found an empty garden. There was no stranger hiding near the fence, no open gate, and no obvious sign that someone had entered. From her perspective, that was enough. A frightened teenager had awakened during the night, heard a sound, and interpreted it as a threat. She probably believed that dismissing it would calm me. Instead, it made the experience worse. If she had found someone, at least I would have known what I heard. If she had found an animal, broken branch, or loose object, there would have been an explanation. Finding nothing left me with the sound and no proof. The footsteps happened again. It was not every night. Sometimes weeks or months passed without anything unusual. Then, late at night, I would be lying in bed and hear the same heavy movement outside. Boots on gravel. The sound was too familiar to dismiss. Each time, my fear returned immediately. It did not matter that my mother had found nothing before. My body reacted as though the person had come back. I would stop breathing normally and listen. Sometimes the steps seemed to cross one section of the yard. Other times they continued long enough that I imagined someone walking around the house. I never heard the gate open. I never heard a car door or engine. Whoever it was either approached quietly or came from somewhere close enough to reach the property on foot. I still slept with the window open. That may seem unreasonable, but it was a habit I had always had. Even in winter, I liked the cold air. Closing it permanently because of the sounds would have felt like admitting someone had taken control of my room. At the same time, the open window made every incident more frightening. There was no thick glass muting the steps. I heard them clearly. The sound entered the room as though I were standing outside with the person. I told my mother more than once. She continued suggesting dreams, animals, and trees. It did not matter that I was no longer a little child. I was old enough to recognize the difference between a branch and a boot. It also did not matter that the sound happened several times. Each event was treated as another mistake. Maybe she did not want to believe someone was entering the yard. Parents sometimes dismiss danger because accepting it would mean admitting the home is not completely safe. If she believed me, she would have to consider calling the police, adding locks, checking the fence, or staying awake at night. It was easier to believe I had been dreaming. There are ordinary explanations for the footsteps. A large animal could create heavy movement on gravel. Dogs, foxes, deer, and other animals sometimes sound surprisingly human when you cannot see them. A dog walking slowly across a gravel path might create 4 separate footfalls that blend into the rhythm of 2 boots. If the animal paused and moved carefully, I could imagine a person. I do not remember hearing claws, panting, or movement through plants. But not every animal makes those sounds clearly. Someone in a nearby property could also have been responsible. At night, sound travels farther because there is less traffic and background noise. A person walking on another path might sound as though they were directly outside my window. Fences, walls, and houses can reflect noise in misleading ways. The footsteps may have belonged to a neighbor returning home, someone walking along the street, or a person crossing another garden. Because my window was open, the sound entered clearly. My frightened brain then placed the source in our backyard. That explanation is possible. But I knew the direction of the sound. It came from beneath or beyond my window, not from the road. The footsteps also seemed too close. There was a difference between hearing someone pass outside the front of the house and hearing someone move through the private space behind it. The gravel in our yard had its own particular sound. I recognized it. Temperature changes could also make parts of the property move, gravel settling, gutters expanding, and old fences shifting might produce repeated cracks or crunches. A tree branch dragging across stones in the wind could imitate footsteps for a short time. My mother's explanation was not impossible, but the rhythm was too regular. The sound traveled from one place to another. It did not remain fixed like a loose object knocking against the ground. Another possibility is that I experienced a sleep-related hallucination. People can wake and hear sounds that are not physically present. Footsteps are common because the brain is alert for approaching danger. If I was drifting between sleep and wakefulness, I might hear someone walking, even though the garden was empty. The sound could feel completely real. The intense fear and inability to move may have been related to sleep paralysis or a similar state. That would explain why I froze. Sleep paralysis can occur when the mind wakes before the body fully leaves sleep. People may hear footsteps, voices, breathing, or someone entering a room. However, I do not remember being physically unable to move. I was terrified, but I eventually got out of bed and went to my mother. The fear felt like a normal response to danger, not a strange sleep state. I was also awake long enough to listen carefully. The footsteps were not one brief sound that disappeared as soon as I became alert. They continued. The most frightening explanation is that someone really was entering our backyard. A person could easily hide when my mother came outside. The beam of a torch only shows a narrow area at a time. If the garden contained bushes, corners, sheds, or dark spaces near the fence, someone could remain unseen. They might hear the back door open and leave before she searched. A person familiar with the area would know where to climb out, or where the light could not reach. If they wore dark clothing and stayed still, my mother might pass close without seeing them. It is also possible they had already left by the time I found her. I spent time lying frozen, gathering courage, walking through the house, and waking her. That gave the person several minutes. They could be far away before the torch came on. The repeated visits suggest they may have been checking the property. Burglars sometimes watch houses before attempting to enter. They learn when people sleep, which windows are open, whether dogs are present, and how quickly residents respond to noises. Someone could have been walking through the yard to look for tools, bicycles, unlocked doors, or anything valuable. They might not have known I was awake. My open window meant I could hear them before they realized anyone had noticed. The person may also have been a local teenager or someone playing a prank. They could walk across the gravel, wait for lights to come on, and run. But I never heard laughter or hurried movement. The footsteps did not sound playful. They were slow and heavy. That impression may come from fear, but it felt as though the person was there for a reason. Not long afterward, the town began experiencing serious crime. Dogs were stolen. Homes were broken into. There were stabbings and other violent incidents. The area no longer felt as safe as people had assumed. I do not know whether the person outside my window had anything to do with those crimes. There is no evidence connecting them. The timing may be coincidence. A rise in local crime can make earlier unexplained events seem more threatening than they appeared at the time. Once I heard about thieves entering gardens and stealing dogs, I naturally wondered whether one of them had been in ours. When reports of break-ins spread, I thought about someone checking the house. When I heard about violence, the boots outside the window became attached to a person who might have been carrying a weapon. Those later events changed the memory. Before them, the footsteps were unexplained. After them, they seemed like a warning. My mother still did not believe the sounds proved someone had entered our yard. From her point of view, the town's crimes did not make every nighttime noise an intruder. She was right about that. Fear can connect unrelated events. A dog theft elsewhere does not prove a person stood beneath my window. A break-in on another street does not identify the source of footsteps months earlier. But the crimes proved something important to me. People really were moving through private properties at night. The idea was no longer impossible or paranoid. There were strangers willing to enter gardens, approach houses, and take things. My fear had always been realistic. I wish we had installed a camera. Even a simple motion light might have shown whether someone was there. Tracks in the gravel could have been checked the following morning. A gate alarm, locked fence, or dog might have changed the situation. Instead, each incident ended the same way. I heard the footsteps. I became frightened. Someone checked too late or not at all. Nothing was found. Then, normal life continued until the sound returned. The lack of proof does not mean nobody was there. It only means we never caught them. I have not heard the footsteps for years. That could mean the source was ordinary and eventually disappeared. A neighbor moved. An animal changed its route. A tree was cut back. A loose part of the house was repaired. I grew older, slept differently, or stopped noticing the sound. It could also mean the person stopped coming. Maybe they found another property. Perhaps they were arrested, left the town, or eventually realized our house had nothing worth taking. There is no satisfying ending. No one was caught outside the window. No confession explained the repeated visits. I never pulled the curtain aside and saw a face. Part of me is grateful for that. If I had looked and found an animal, the fear would have ended. If I had found nothing, I would still have doubts. If I had seen a person looking back, I am not sure I would have ever slept near an open window again. The experience taught me that fear can be physical. I did not only think someone might be outside, my whole body believed it. The inability to move was not weakness. It was the brain choosing silence, because movement might reveal my position. Humans have survived by freezing when predators or dangerous people are close. At 14, I did not analyze it that way. I only knew I was lying in bed while heavy boots moved through the darkness. The person did not knock. They did not call my name. They gave no reason for being there. That uncertainty made the sound worse. A visitor comes to the front door. A lost person asks for help. Someone who walks quietly through a backyard at night is trying not to be noticed. I still believe the footsteps were real. I understand that I may have misjudged the distance or source. I understand that animals, echoes, and sleep can create convincing sounds. There is no physical evidence left. But I heard them on more than one night. They sounded the same each time. Heavy boots pressing into gravel. Slow enough to be deliberate. Close enough that I was afraid to breathe. My mother's torch found an empty yard because the person had time to leave or knew how to hide. That is what I believe. I do not claim they were connected to every crime that later happened in town. I do not know whether they wanted to enter our house, steal an animal, or only cross the property. I know only that they did not belong there. Our backyard was not a public path. No one had permission to walk around beneath my bedroom window at 1 in the morning. Whoever wore those boots was not welcome. Years have passed since I last heard them, but I still remember the first night clearly. The open window, the cold air, the slow crunch outside, the effort it took to leave the bed. My voice barely working as I whispered to my mother that someone was in the backyard. Her torch moving through the darkness and finding nothing. Her telling me it was only trees or a dream. Then, on another night, the same footsteps returning. Step, step, step. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was sound traveling from another garden, an animal, or something my half-awake mind created. But when the town later filled with stories of stolen dogs, broken windows, and people being attacked, I stopped feeling foolish for being afraid. I had been listening to someone move through the dark outside my bedroom. I may never know who they were or what they wanted. I only know that every time those boots crossed the gravel, my body understood the danger before anyone else believed it was there. Story 14. When I was around 11 or 12 years old, sometime in the late 1980s, I had a habit of falling asleep while listening to music. This was before streaming, smartphones, or having thousands of songs available instantly. I usually listened to cassette tapes on an old boombox in my bedroom. Sometimes I played the same tape over and over until I knew every song. Other nights, I left the radio on and listened to whatever the station happened to be playing. The music helped me fall asleep. I liked having sound in the room because complete silence made me more aware of every creak in the house. With the radio playing softly, I could focus on the voices and instruments instead of wondering whether a noise came from the hallway or outside my window. One particular night, I left the radio station on. I do not remember what program was playing or what song I heard before falling asleep. It was probably nothing unusual. There was no frightening story on the radio, no strange voice hidden in the music, and no reason to expect anything different from the hundreds of other nights when I had done the same thing. At some point, I fell asleep. The next thing I remember is waking up. At least, I believed I had woken up. The room looked normal. It was dark, but I could see enough to recognize everything around me. The boombox was still playing near the other side of the room, and the sound had become irritating. Maybe the station was between songs, or perhaps the music had become louder than I wanted. I only remember deciding that I needed to switch it off. I got out of bed. There was nothing frightening about the moment. I did not feel trapped, dizzy, or confused. I did not struggle to move as people sometimes describe during sleep paralysis. I simply left the bed and crossed the room. The boombox stood in its usual place. I reached toward it and turned the power off. The music stopped. The room became silent. That silence is one of the clearest parts of the memory. One moment, the radio was filling the bedroom with sound. The next, there was nothing. I turned and began moving back toward the bed. Then I saw myself. My body was still lying beneath the sheets. For a few seconds, I could not understand what I was looking at. I remember staring at the bed and thinking that someone else was there. The figure had my hair, my face, and the same sleeping position I had been in before getting up. Then I realized it was me. I was looking at my own body. My eyes were closed. I appeared completely asleep. The sheets were pulled up around me, and they looked smooth and undisturbed. There was no empty space where I should have been lying, and no sign that I had climbed out of bed. My body had never moved. Yet I was standing several feet away, looking at it. The confusion was immediate and overwhelming. I looked down, expecting to see my feet on the floor. That was when I realized I was not actually standing. I was floating. I was slightly above the floor, suspended in the room without feeling any pressure beneath me. There was no sensation of falling. My body felt light, almost without weight. I do not remember seeing a clear second body when I looked down. I was aware of myself, but not in the normal physical way. I had a viewpoint, thoughts, and the feeling of occupying space. Yet the body I recognized as mine was still asleep on the bed. I remained there, staring. I did not know what to do. At 11 or 12, I had no useful explanation for seeing myself from outside my body. I had probably heard stories about ghosts and souls, but I was not thinking clearly enough to connect the experience to any of them. I only knew that I was supposed to be in the bed. Something had gone wrong. Then I heard a voice. Get back in your body. I do not know where the voice came from. It may have been my own thought, but it did not feel like an ordinary thought at the time. It seemed separate enough that I heard the words clearly. The voice was not shouting. It did not sound angry or threatening. It was direct, almost like an instruction from someone who understood what was happening better than I did. Get back in your body. The words made me realize that whatever I was experiencing was dangerous, or at least that I should not remain outside myself. I moved toward the bed. I do not remember walking or using my arms and legs. I seemed to drift forward. Then I lowered myself onto the sleeping body. The moment the two forms met, I woke up. This time, I knew I was awake. I opened my eyes in bed. My heart was beating hard, and the room felt different from the one I had just crossed. The boombox was off. The radio was silent. The sheets were pulled up around me. They were smooth and almost completely unruffled. I had not kicked them aside. There was no sign that I had stood, crossed the room, turned off the radio, and returned to bed. That detail confused me more than anything else. If I had been sleepwalking, I would expect the sheets to be disturbed. I would have needed to push them away, place my feet on the floor, walk across the room, and climb back underneath them. Even if I had done all of that carefully, the bedding should have looked different. Instead, it appeared as though my body had remained in the same position the entire time. But the radio was off. I clearly remembered turning it off. I lay there listening to the silence, trying to understand what had happened. Maybe the radio had shut off by itself. Some boomboxes had sleep timers or loose power switches. A cassette might stop automatically when it reached the end, although I had been listening to a radio station rather than a tape. There could have been a temporary power interruption. Perhaps the station went silent. But I remembered pressing the power button. I remembered the movement of crossing the room and the exact moment the sound stopped. More importantly, I remembered seeing myself in bed. The experience did not feel like a normal dream. Dreams often contain strange events that seem logical while they are happening. Rooms change shape, people appear in impossible places, and the dreamer rarely questions any of it. This felt different. The bedroom remained accurate. The boombox was where it belonged. The bed looked normal. I recognized every part of the room. The impossible thing was not the environment. It was me. I was in two places at once. I do not remember whether I told anyone immediately. I may have been afraid they would laugh or tell me it was only a dream. Even now, that is the most likely explanation. I may have had a false awakening. A false awakening happens when someone dreams that they have woken up and begun their normal routine. They may get out of bed, turn on lights, walk through the house, or speak to family members. Everything can look completely real. Then they wake again and discover none of it happened. In my case, I could have dreamed that I woke to turn off the radio. The sight of my sleeping body might have been the moment the dream became stranger. The voice telling me to return could have been my brain preparing to wake. When I lay down on the body, the dream ended. That explanation fits much of what I remember. The boombox being off could be a coincidence. Perhaps it had already turned off because of a timer, power loss, or a mechanical problem. My sleeping mind noticed the sudden silence and created a dream in which I caused it. Sound often enters dreams. An alarm becomes a telephone ringing inside the dream. A television becomes a conversation between dream characters. A radio switching off could become the action of crossing the room and pressing a button. This may be what happened. I might have fallen asleep while the radio played. The power cut out briefly, or the boombox stopped. My brain recognized the change and built a realistic dream around it. Then I woke and found the room silent, exactly as expected. The untouched sheets would make sense because I never physically left the bed. The experience of floating and seeing myself could have been part of a vivid dream. There is also a sleep state called an out-of-body experience, although that name describes the sensation rather than proving that anything actually leaves the body. People sometimes report seeing themselves from above or from another part of the room. These experiences often happen while falling asleep, waking under extreme stress, during illness, or in other altered states. The brain normally combines signals from the eyes, inner ear, skin, and muscles to create the feeling that the self is located inside the body. If those signals become temporarily confused, the mind can place the sense of self somewhere else. A person may feel as though they are floating near the ceiling, standing beside the bed, or looking down at their own body. That may be what happened to me. My brain was still asleep enough to create the image of the room, but awake enough for me to think clearly and remember it afterward. The floating sensation could come from the inner ear, which controls balance. During sleep, the body is still while the brain can simulate movement. Without normal physical feedback, floating can feel completely real. The voice may have been an auditory hallucination connected to the same state. People sometimes hear their name, a command, a whisper, or a short sentence while falling asleep or waking. The words can feel as though they come from another person, even when they are produced by the brain. Get back in your body matched the situation so perfectly that it felt like guidance, but perhaps it was simply my own mind trying to end the experience. I saw my body. I understood I was outside it. My subconscious created the instruction necessary to return. That explanation is reasonable. Still, there are details that continue to bother me. The first is the radio. If I never left the bed, why was it off? It could have stopped on its own, but I had no memory of setting a timer. I do not know whether that boombox even had one. A temporary power cut should have affected other devices in the house, though I never checked. The power button may also have been mechanical, meaning it would remain in the on position even if electricity failed. If I looked the next morning and found the switch physically off, that would have been stronger evidence. Unfortunately, I do not remember checking it closely. I only know the music was no longer playing. Another possibility is that I actually sleepwalked. I might have left the bed, switched off the radio, returned, and fallen asleep, without forming a normal memory. During the return to bed, I could have dreamed that I saw myself. The physical action and dream may have overlapped. Sleepwalkers can perform complicated behaviors while remaining mostly asleep. They may open doors, move objects, eat food, or walk through the house. Many have no memory afterward. I have never had a known history of sleepwalking, but one episode is possible. Children and teenagers can sleepwalk even if they never do it again. The bedding does not completely rule it out. I might have slid out without pulling the sheets away much. When I returned, I could have arranged them around myself without remembering. What looked unruffled in the darkness may not have been perfectly smooth. Fear can make small details seem more important and certain than they were. But the memory of seeing myself does not feel like a normal sleepwalking event. Sleepwalkers are usually not fully aware of their surroundings. I remember the room clearly and felt conscious enough to question what I saw. Maybe I was awake physically, but dreaming visually. Perhaps I stood beside the bed in a confused state and mistook a pile of blankets for my body. The shape beneath the sheets could have looked like a sleeping person because the pillows and bedding remained raised. If I saw my own face, however, that explanation does not work. I remember recognizing myself, but memory from a frightening event can change over time. Maybe I did not see detailed facial features. Perhaps I saw the shape of a body and somehow knew it was me. Dream logic could have supplied the identity without a clear image. There is also the possibility that the entire experience happened during sleep paralysis, even though I did not feel paralyzed. Sleep paralysis is often described as waking unable to move, but it can include sensations of leaving the body, floating, hearing voices, or moving through the room. The movement may feel real, even while the physical body remains still. I could have believed I walked to the radio while never moving at all. When I saw the body, I may have become aware that my physical form was still in bed. The voice then helped me wake fully. I have no history of sleep paralysis, but not everyone experiences it repeatedly. A single episode can happen because of stress, irregular sleep, exhaustion, or no clear reason. I was young, and my sleep pattern may have been different that night. The radio could have kept part of my brain alert while the rest entered deep sleep. That mixture may have produced the experience. The supernatural interpretation is that I truly left my body. Some people believe consciousness or the soul can separate temporarily during sleep. They describe floating through rooms, looking down at themselves, traveling to distant places, or being pulled back suddenly. My experience shares several details with those stories. I moved around the room. I saw my body. I realized I was floating. A voice told me to return. I lay down into myself and woke immediately. The radio being off could could be taken as evidence that I interacted with the physical world while outside my body. But that creates another problem. If I had no physical hands, how did I press the power button? A spirit capable of touching a boombox should also disturb the room in other ways. I remember the action as normal, but perhaps it never happened physically. The silent radio may only have convinced me that it did. Another possibility is that something other than my own subconscious gave the instruction. Maybe the voice belonged to a protective presence. If being outside the body was dangerous, perhaps something nearby told me what to do. The voice did not frighten me. It was firm but helpful. It did not ask me to follow it, stay outside, or move farther from the bed. It told me to return. If I choose a spiritual explanation, I find that part comforting. Whatever spoke seemed to want me safe. But there is no way to know whether the voice was external. The brain can create words that feel separate from the self. We all experience thoughts that arrive suddenly, and in a dream state, those thoughts can sound spoken. The command also used language I already understood. I must have known, at least generally, the idea that a person could be in or out of their body. Even if I had never studied out-of-body experiences, cartoons, religious ideas, or stories may have given me that basic concept. My mind used the phrase that made the most sense. I have often wondered what would have happened if I ignored it. Could I have continued floating through the room? Would I have traveled into the hallway or outside the house? Would I have woken naturally after a few seconds? Or would the experience have become more frightening? That question is probably meaningless if it was only a dream. Dreams change according to expectation. If I had decided to explore, the room might have transformed into something else. The voice, in return, gave the dream a clean ending. Perhaps that is why I remember it so clearly. There was a beginning, a discovery, an instruction, and an immediate awakening. Most ordinary dreams fade because they have no clear structure. This one felt like an event. I also remember the emotional change. When I first crossed the room, I felt normal. Seeing the body caused confusion rather than immediate terror. The fear came only after I realized I was floating and heard the instruction. That gradual understanding made it different from a nightmare. There was no monster. Nothing chased me. The room did not become dark or distorted. The frightening thing was the idea that I had separated from myself. The body in the bed looked vulnerable. It was breathing and sleeping without me. For a moment, I wondered whether it was dead. I do not remember checking whether its chest moved, but the possibility must have passed through my mind. If I was outside, what kept it alive? If I stayed away too long, could I return? The voice answered those questions before I could fully form them. Get back in your body. I obeyed immediately. The experience never happened again. I did not continue seeing myself from outside or waking near the ceiling. I never developed a pattern of sleepwalking. I did not begin hearing voices at night. That single event remained isolated. Its rarity supports the idea of an unusual but natural sleep experience. Brains do strange things during the transitions between sleep and wakefulness. One intense episode does not require an ongoing condition. Still, because it happened only once, I could never compare it to another experience. I could not test whether the radio always turned off, whether the voice returned, or whether certain sleeping positions caused the floating sensation. There was no pattern, only memory. Over the years, I have questioned how much of it occurred exactly as I remember. Maybe I dreamed the entire thing and noticed the radio was off only after waking. Maybe I physically turned it off before falling asleep and forgot. I could have woken briefly, switched it off normally, returned to bed, and then dreamed about seeing myself. The real action may have happened earlier than the strange part. Memory could join them into one sequence. Perhaps I had not fallen asleep before turning off the radio at all. I might have walked across the room while very tired, returned to bed, then dreamed that I was still standing and looking at myself. When I woke, the radio was naturally off because I had switched it off while awake. That is a simple explanation. It would also account for the sheets if I had adjusted them after returning, but I remember the body being under them before I lay down. That image is the part I cannot remove. Even now, I can picture the view from beside the bed, my own sleeping face, the shape of my body beneath the sheets, the silent room after the radio stopped, the strange absence of weight beneath me. Then, the voice. I do not claim that my soul left my body. I cannot prove that consciousness can travel independently of the brain. A vivid false awakening or out-of-body illusion is much more likely. The experience happened at an age when sleep can be deep, dreams can be intense, and the boundary between imagination and waking perception is not always clear. The normal explanations make sense, but understanding them has never completely settled the memory. Most dreams feel different after waking. They become soft around the edges. The rooms no longer seem accurate. The actions lose their physical weight. This one has remained sharp. I remember walking toward the boombox. I remember reaching out. I remember the click as the radio switched off. I remember turning toward the bed and seeing that I had never left it. Then I understood that I was not standing on the floor at all. I was floating beside my own sleeping body. A voice, whether mine or something else, told me to return. I lowered myself onto the bed. The instant I touched the body, I opened my eyes from inside it. The radio was off. The sheets were still pulled neatly around me, and there was no sign that I had ever moved.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
My father had to leave town for a few days, but I stayed behind because I could not afford to miss class or work. Before he left, he told me that our neighbor, Jim, would keep an eye on me. I remember thinking that the whole arrangement was unnecessary. I was 21 years old, in good shape, and perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Jim was around 75. In my mind, if anything serious happened, I was more likely to be the one helping him. Still, my father felt better knowing someone nearby was paying attention. Jim lived directly next door. Our porches were only about 6 feet apart, close enough that we could speak to each other without raising our voices. He was quiet, observant, and much more private than most people in the neighborhood. I knew he had worked for Xerox in Europe at some point. That was about it. He had never given me any reason to think there was more to his life than an ordinary career, retirement, and the occasional conversation across the porch. My father trusted him, though. Before leaving, he spoke to Jim and asked him to watch the house while I was alone. Jim agreed. I told them both I would be fine. There was already some concern about a man I will call X. The police knew about him, and for a while there had been enough worry that people were paying attention to where he was. Then, after a few days, the authorities seemed to believe he had left town. The immediate concern died down. I began returning to my normal routine. I went to class. I went to work. I came home. Nothing happened. After several uneventful days, the tension started feeling exaggerated. It seemed that X had gone somewhere else, and that everyone had been worried for no reason. One afternoon, I was sitting on our screened-in porch reading. It was a comfortable place to sit when the weather was good. The screen kept insects out, but the porch still felt open to the street and the neighboring houses. I had a book in my hands and was completely absorbed in it. I was not listening for footsteps. I was not watching the road. I had no reason to believe anyone dangerous was nearby. At some point, I looked up. A man was staring at me. He was already on the porch. That was the first detail that felt wrong. I did not remember hearing the outer screen door open. I did not remember inviting him inside. Maybe I had been so focused on the book that I missed the sound. Perhaps he knocked, and I responded without remembering. But there he was, standing within the enclosed porch as though he belonged there. His face looked familiar. I could not immediately place him, but I felt that I had seen him before. He looked ordinary enough that my mind did not jump straight to danger. He held a clipboard, which gave the impression that he was conducting some kind of official business. His manner was extremely polite. "Excuse me," he said. Then he asked whether I was me, using my actual name, and mentioned a voter registration survey. It was the kind of interaction people have at their front doors all the time. Someone arrives with a clipboard. They confirm your name. They ask a few questions. You either participate or tell them you are not interested. The politeness made me lower my guard. I nodded and stood. By confirming the name, I told him that he had found the right person. Then I looked down at the clipboard. There was a knife resting on it. Not a pen, not a survey form, a kitchen knife. It was a completely ordinary knife, the kind nearly everyone has in a drawer at home. That made it worse. There was no dramatic hunting blade or weapon designed to look threatening. It was a simple household object, placed openly across the clipboard as though he had forgotten to hide it. For a second, my mind refused to understand what I was seeing. A man conducting a voter survey should have a pen. A man standing inside a stranger's porch should not be carrying a kitchen knife. The object changed the entire scene. His politeness no longer felt reassuring. It felt rehearsed. The clipboard was not proof that he was legitimate. It was camouflage. Then I recognized him. He was X. That was why his face had seemed familiar. I had probably seen a photograph or heard enough descriptions to know him without immediately understanding how. The police thought he had left town. He had not. He was standing in front of me. Worse, I realized that he had not known what my father looked like. He had arrived looking for someone by name. When he asked whether I was that person, I answered. I had just identified myself to him. The thought came clearly and calmly. This could go very badly. There was not much space between us. He was already inside the screened porch. The door into the house was behind me, or close enough that reaching it would require moving past him. If I tried to run, he could grab me. If I shouted, he could attack before anyone arrived. I was young and physically fit, but that did not make the knife harmless. People often imagine that being strong or athletic will protect them in a confrontation. It does not take much strength to use a blade at close range. Even if I managed to fight him off, one injury could be enough. For a moment, neither of us moved. He was still holding the clipboard. The knife remained visible. I do not know whether he expected me to recognize him. Maybe he planned to distract me with the survey and move closer. Perhaps the knife was meant to intimidate me once he confirmed my identity. Maybe he had intended to conceal it, but placed it on the clipboard without thinking. I never found out exactly what he planned. Then I heard a click. It was a small sound. Under normal circumstances, it might have gone unnoticed. In that moment, it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Jim was standing on his porch. He had a pistol aimed at X. The two porches were only 6 feet apart, so Jim did not need to shout across a yard or approach through the street. He was close. He had a clear view of the man, the clipboard, the knife, and me. Jim told X that if he tried anything, Jim would end him. The wording was direct. There was no nervous negotiation and no long warning. The 75-year-old neighbor my father had asked to keep an eye on me was suddenly the most dangerous person in the situation. X looked as surprised as I felt. He had probably focused entirely on me. Maybe he knew my father was out of town. Perhaps he believed I was alone. He may not have considered the elderly man on the porch next door a threat. Jim's presence changed everything. X was still holding the knife, but his attention shifted away from me. That gave me an opening. I kicked him as hard as I could between the legs. I did not plan it carefully. There was no complicated self-defense technique. I had one moment while he was distracted, and I used it. The kick landed hard. X dropped the knife. For some reason, he held onto the clipboard. That detail has always seemed absurd to me. The knife hit the porch floor, but he kept the object that had been part of his disguise. Maybe his hand closed around it from panic. Perhaps he thought it contained information he did not want to leave behind. Or maybe the body simply does strange things when someone is suddenly injured and facing an armed neighbor. Whatever the reason, he turned and ran. He did not merely leave quickly. He ran up the street as though his life depended on it, still carrying the clipboard. Watching him move would have been almost funny if the situation had not been so dangerous. He was limping badly, but fear and adrenaline kept him moving. Later, I compared him to Phytopedes, the legendary runner, although X's version involved fleeing a screened porch after being kicked in a very vulnerable place. Jim kept his pistol ready, while X disappeared up the road. I stood there trying to understand how quickly the situation had changed. A few seconds earlier, I had been alone with a man carrying a knife. Now the knife was on the porch floor, the man was running away, and my elderly neighbor was calmly holding a gun from 6 feet away. The police were called. They found X around 20 minutes later, limping along a nearby road. Apparently, I had ruptured something when I kicked him. I did not feel guilty. He had entered my porch under a false reason, confirmed my identity, and brought a knife. Whatever injury he received happened because I believed I was in immediate danger. He was taken into custody. I later learned that he was sent back to prison for multiple parole violations. What I found strange was that my name was apparently left out of the official details. I do not know whether that was done to protect me, to simplify the case, or because Jim had influence I did not understand at the time. The lack of my name may have been connected to the fact that the authorities already knew X and did not need my involvement to establish the violations. There may have been legal reasons nobody explained to me. All I knew was that the man was gone and that I was not publicly attached to the incident. While the police were dealing with X, Jim came over to my house. He brought whiskey. That was when the afternoon became even stranger. I had always believed Jim had worked for Xerox in Europe. That was the ordinary explanation I had been given for his years abroad. Now, after appearing on his porch with a pistol and handling the situation with complete calm, he began telling me stories about working for the CIA. At first, I was not sure whether the whiskey had encouraged him to exaggerate. Older people sometimes enjoy making their past sound more dramatic, especially after an event that proves they can still handle themselves. But Jim did not tell the stories like someone inventing an action film. He spoke as though he were finally explaining small parts of himself that had never made sense before. The confidence, the awareness, the fact that he noticed X entering my porch before I realized how much danger I was in. Maybe the Xerox job had been real. Maybe it had been a cover. Perhaps the truth was somewhere between the two, involving intelligence work connected to his employment overseas. I never received enough proof to know exactly what Jim had done. But after that afternoon, I stopped assuming he was simply a harmless, retired office worker. My father had asked a 75-year-old man to watch out for me. I had thought the idea was ridiculous. It turned out my father had chosen extremely well. Jim had been paying attention. I still do not know when he first noticed X. Maybe he saw him walking toward the house. Perhaps he watched X open the porch door without knocking. He could have recognized that something about the visitor was wrong before seeing the knife. He may have noticed the way X stood, how he looked around, or how he positioned himself near me. Jim's old training, whatever it truly was, may have allowed him to read the situation immediately. He did not come over and ask whether everything was all right. He did not call my name and alert X. He quietly armed himself, stepped onto his porch, and waited until he had control of the situation. The click I heard was the sound of that control becoming visible. That small sound may have saved my life. Later, Jim asked me not to tell my father how close X had come. He was not trying to protect himself from blame in the ordinary sense. He said that if my father knew exactly what happened, Jim would feel as though he had let him down. That statement confused me. Jim had done the opposite. He had noticed the danger, intervened, and prevented X from attacking me. Without him, the situation could have ended terribly. But I think Jim saw responsibility differently. My father had asked him to keep me safe. In Jim's mind, X should never have reached the porch. He should never have stood close enough for me to see the knife. The fact that Jim stopped him at the final moment still meant the threat had come too near. I agreed not to tell my father every detail. But I had a condition. Jim had to teach me how to shoot. After the incident, I no longer felt as confident about being 21 and in good shape. Physical fitness had not warned me that X was inside the porch. Strength had not made the knife less dangerous. I had survived because another person had been watching and was prepared. I wanted to be prepared too. Jim agreed to teach me. Unfortunately, it turned out that I was a terrible shot. No matter how carefully he explained stance, grip, breathing, and aim, I did not have much natural ability with a firearm. I was not completely incapable, but I was nowhere near as accurate or calm as Jim. He must have decided that giving me a gun would create as many problems as it solved. Instead, he gave me a nightstick. He claimed it had belonged to an East German border guard. By then, I had learned not to dismiss Jim's stories too quickly. Maybe the nightstick really had come from East Germany. Maybe he bought it at a shop years later and enjoyed the story. Either way, it was solid, simple, and did not require good aim. The whole experience eventually became one of those stories that sounds almost funny when told from a safe distance. An elderly neighbor with a secret CIA history. A man running up the street with a clipboard after being kicked. Whiskey on the porch. A failed shooting lesson. An East German nightstick. But the humor sits on top of something much darker. X knew enough to come to my house while my father was away. He knew my name. He used a polite survey as an excuse to confirm my identity. He entered the screened porch without me remembering that I had allowed him in. He carried a kitchen knife openly on his clipboard. The police believed he had left town, which meant I was not expecting him. If Jim had been inside his house, asleep, or simply not looking out the window, I might have been alone with X for much longer. I often think about how easily I trusted the situation at first. The clipboard did most of the work. It made him look official. People carrying clipboards are associated with surveys, repairs, deliveries, or government work. They ask questions. They stand at doors. They confirm names. Nothing about that seems threatening until you notice the object where the pen should be. X also used politeness as a weapon. He did not rush toward me. He did not shout. He calmly asked whether I was the person he wanted. I answered because the question sounded normal. By the time I recognized him, he had already confirmed that he had found me. The familiarity of his face came back too slowly. That delay may have been what he was counting on. People believe danger will announce itself. They expect anger, masks, raised voices, or obvious weapons. Sometimes danger arrives, speaking carefully and holding a clipboard. I have also wondered whether X intentionally left the knife visible. Maybe he wanted me to see it after answering. The knife could have been a warning not to shout or run. Perhaps the moment I looked down and understood, he expected me to become compliant. If so, the plan nearly worked. I froze long enough to realize how badly the situation could end. Then, Jim's pistol clicked. The timing was almost perfect. It gave me enough confidence to act, but it did not give X enough time to turn the knife on me. People have occasionally questioned whether kicking him was necessary once Jim had a gun aimed at him. From inside the moment, it was necessary. X had not dropped the knife. Jim was 6 feet away on another porch, with screens and railings between us. A gun does not make someone holding a blade harmless. X could still have lunged before Jim fired. I did not know whether Jim would shoot quickly enough or whether the bullet might hit me at that distance. The kick removed X's ability to attack and forced him to drop the knife. It was not elegant, but it worked. The injury was more serious than I expected. I did not know I had ruptured anything until the police found him. Adrenaline probably allowed him to run much farther than he otherwise could. The image of him limping down the road 20 minutes later is almost unbelievable. He had escaped the immediate scene, but had no real plan. He was injured, visible, and already known to the police. The clipboard did not help him look legitimate anymore. I sometimes wonder what was written on it. Was there actually a survey form? Did it contain my name and address? Were there other names? The fact that he kept it suggests it may have mattered. Perhaps it was only instinct. But if the clipboard contained information about me or other people, I wish I knew what police found. That might explain why my name was kept out of the later case. Maybe the authorities discovered enough evidence to handle everything without needing me as a public witness. It is possible Jim knew more about that process than he told me. After hearing his stories, I began looking back at the way he handled everything. He was 75, but he did not panic. He did not accidentally fire. He did not wave the pistol around or try to play the hero. He gave a clear warning and kept the weapon focused on the threat. Once X ran, Jim did not chase him. He stayed with me and allowed police to handle the search. That was not the behavior of someone acting on impulse. Whatever his past was, he had experience. The old man my father assigned as my protector turned out to be far more capable than I was. That humbled me. Before the incident, I treated safety as a matter of confidence. I was 21. I was strong. I knew the house. I believed I would notice if something was wrong. But I did not notice the screen door opening. I did not recognize X immediately. I confirmed my name before looking at the clipboard. I was only saved because someone else saw what I missed. The screened porch had always felt like part of the house, but it was not fully secure. The door could be opened from outside. The screens gave visibility without real protection. X had crossed that weak boundary while I was reading. He did not need to break a lock or smash glass. He simply entered a space that felt private, but was physically accessible. Afterward, I never looked at porches, surveys, or unexpected visitors the same way. Even now, I pay attention when someone asks me to confirm personal information at the door. I do not assume a uniform, badge, clipboard, or polite voice proves anything. I verify who they are before giving them a name. I keep a locked barrier between us. That is not paranoia. It is a lesson I learned from seeing a kitchen knife where a pen should have been. My father eventually learned that something happened with X, but I kept my promise to Jim and did not explain how close it came. At least, not at the time. I am not sure whether keeping that secret was the right choice. My father would have been furious and frightened, but he also deserved to know that his concern had been justified. Jim's request came from pride and responsibility. He believed my father had trusted him to prevent danger, not merely stop it at the final second. I respected that, and I owed him. The arrangement my father made, which I had mocked privately, was the reason I came through the incident unharmed. Jim did not let him down. He protected me exactly when I needed it. The only mistake was mine for assuming I did not need anyone watching out for me. I kept the nightstick he gave me. Whether it truly came from an East German border guard, I cannot say. With Jim, almost any version of the story could have been true. Perhaps it passed through his hands during some covert assignment in Europe. Perhaps a retired Xerox employee purchased it as a souvenir. The mystery is part of why I remember him so fondly. The nightstick was not as dramatic as a pistol, but it represented something important. Preparedness did not need to look impressive. It needed to be available when politeness failed and danger came close. Years later, the part I remember most clearly is still the click. I was standing inside the screened porch with X only a few feet away. He had my name. He had a knife. He had entered without me noticing. I was trying to calculate whether I could reach the house before he reached me. Then, the sound came from next door. A single mechanical click. I looked over and saw 75-year-old Jim on his porch, holding a pistol with the steadiness of someone who had done much more in his life than repair copying machines in Europe. X looked at him. I looked at him. For 1 second, all three of us understood that the situation had changed. Then I kicked X as hard as I could. The knife hit the floor, and he ran up the street, still clutching his clipboard. The police caught him 20 minutes later. Jim came over with whiskey. And that was how I learned that the old neighbor I thought I did not need may have saved my life. When I was around 5 years old, I was getting ready to go out for dinner with my mother. We were going to my favorite restaurant, so I was more excited than I probably should have been. At that age, going somewhere I loved felt like a major event. I remember being impatient, full of energy, and unable to sit still inside the house while waiting for my mother to finish getting ready. Eventually, I decided to go outside and wait for her. It was around 6:30 in the evening, but it was winter, so the sky was already completely dark. The air was cold, and the neighborhood had that quiet feeling winter evenings sometimes have. Most people were probably inside eating dinner, watching television, or settling in for the night. I stood near the house and looked up at the sky. I had no particular reason for doing it. I was only waiting, and the sky looked beautiful. There were stars visible above me, and I remember feeling calm. I was excited about dinner, but nothing around me felt dangerous or unusual. Then, something came into view from behind the house. At first, my 5-year-old mind thought it was a giant asteroid. I saw a massive object moving through the air, tumbling as it traveled. Because it rotated over and over, it looked almost as though it were rolling across the sky. It did not move like an aeroplane. It did not look like a bird, helicopter, or firework. It looked like a huge, burning rock. The object seemed enormous. The best way I can describe its apparent size is to tell someone to hold their hand out at arm's length and look at it against the sky. That was roughly how large it appeared to me. It was not a tiny point of light like a normal shooting star. It took up a noticeable section of my vision. Even as a child, I understood that it looked much larger than anything I had ever seen falling through the sky. It also seemed very low. I had no real ability to judge altitude at 5 years old, but it looked as though it was only a few hundred feet above the ground, perhaps 400 or 500 feet. It did not seem distant like a star or aircraft high in the atmosphere. It appeared close enough that I expected to hear it. The object was covered in fire, but not in the way something looks when it is completely swallowed by flames. The surface itself remained visible. It reminded me of a piece of wood burning in a fire. Parts of it glowed while thin tendrils of flame moved from the sides. The flames seemed to trail and curl around the object as it turned. I watched it tumble through the darkness. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing a trick on me. I blinked several times. The object remained there. It continued moving across the sky. I remember the feeling of looking away for a fraction of a second, and then opening my eyes again, expecting the image to disappear. It did not. Whatever I was seeing seemed physically present. I was too young to understand how unusual it was. I knew only that something huge and burning was passing over or near our house. My excitement about going to the restaurant disappeared. I ran back inside. I told my mother what I had seen. I tried to explain that there was a giant burning asteroid outside and that it looked close to the house. She did not react with the same urgency. She said something like, "Oh, that's nice, honey." It was the kind of answer adults give when a small child describes something they assume came from imagination. She clearly did not believe that a massive burning object had just crossed the sky. From her point of view, that reaction probably made sense. I was 5 years old, standing outside alone in the dark, excited about going to dinner. Children often mistake planes, clouds, lights, and ordinary objects for something dramatic. Maybe she thought I had seen a shooting star. Perhaps she believed I was inventing a story because I was bored. I do not remember whether she went outside to look. By the time I returned, the object may already have disappeared behind trees, houses, or the horizon. There was nothing I could show her. All I had was my description. We probably continued with our evening and went to dinner as planned, but the object stayed in my mind. For the next few days, I searched for information about it as best as a young child could. I wanted proof that someone else had seen the same thing. I looked for reports of meteors or asteroids. I listened for adults talking about something falling from the sky. I hoped to find a news report saying that a large meteorite had crashed somewhere nearby. There was nothing. No one reported a massive impact. There were no stories about a fireball destroying a field, road, building, or patch of woodland. There was no mention of emergency crews searching for debris. If an object as large and low as it appeared had truly reached the ground nearby, I believed everyone should have known about it. But life continued normally. I told friends at school. They did not believe me either. To them, it probably sounded like a 5-year-old telling an impossible story. A giant flaming asteroid had rolled through the sky close to my house, yet no one else had seen it, and nothing had crashed. The more people dismissed me, the more confused I became. I began wondering whether something was wrong with me. Maybe I had imagined it. Perhaps I had seen a normal object and changed it into something enormous because I was young. But the memory felt real. I remembered the dark sky. I remembered the object coming from behind the house. I remembered the rotation. I remembered the flames moving along the sides. I remembered blinking and seeing it remain. I knew what I had seen, even if I had no idea what it was. Years later, I began thinking about ordinary explanations. The most obvious possibility is that I saw a meteor. Bright meteors, sometimes called fireballs or bolides, can look much larger and closer than they actually are. An object entering Earth's atmosphere can glow intensely, break apart, and leave a trail of burning material. From the ground, it may appear to move slowly if it is traveling toward or away from the observer at a particular angle. It can also seem close enough to touch, even when it is many miles high. Human beings are poor at judging the size and distance of objects in the night sky because there are few reference points. At 5 years old, I would have been even worse at it. The object may have been much smaller and farther away than it looked. My outstretched hand comparison describes only its apparent size, not its real size. A bright glow can spread across the vision and make a small object seem enormous. The flames may have been a trail of heated gas and fragments, rather than fire burning on the surface of a solid rock. The tumbling or rolling motion could have come from pieces breaking away. If the meteor was irregularly shaped or fragmented as it entered the atmosphere, the brightness might change from one side to another, creating the impression that it rotated. This explanation also accounts for the lack of an impact report. Most meteors burn up before reaching the ground. Even when fragments survive, they may land far away from where an observer thinks they should. A fireball can appear directly overhead while actually traveling over another town or region. The object I saw may never have come near my neighborhood. It may have disappeared high in the atmosphere without leaving any damage. There might have been reports somewhere, but I was too young to find them. In the late days, before internet searches became as simple and complete as they are now, local information would not always be easy to locate. A small newspaper article, astronomy report, or witness account could have existed without reaching me. My mother and school friends may simply not have heard about it. Another possibility is that I saw space debris re-entering the atmosphere. Old satellites, rocket stages, and other human-made objects sometimes fall back toward Earth. Unlike many meteors, space debris can move more slowly across the sky and break into several glowing pieces. The burning sections may look like flaming objects tumbling together. If the debris traveled across a large distance, it could appear low and close, even though it remained high above the ground. A re-entry might last long enough for a child to watch, blink, and study the shape. It might also create the impression of a large, solid object covered in separate tendrils of flame. Again, there may have been no local crash because the debris burned up or landed hundreds of miles away. I would not have known the difference between a natural meteor and something made by humans. To me, anything burning in the sky was an asteroid. A firework is another possibility. Someone may have launched a large firework from behind the house or from a nearby property. Certain fireworks rise, spin, tumble, and produce trailing flames before exploding or burning out. At night, distance can be difficult to judge. A firework much closer to the ground would appear larger than a meteor. The rotating motion could look like a solid burning object. But I do not remember hearing an explosion. The object did not shoot upward and burst into colors. It seemed to move across the sky in a steady path. It looked more like something falling or traveling than something designed for celebration. It was also winter, and not necessarily close to a holiday when fireworks would be expected, although people can use them at any time. A burning sky lantern might also produce a strange effect. Lanterns can drift silently, glow orange, and appear much larger or closer than they really are. If wind turned one sideways or damaged the paper, Flames could extend from the edges. A lantern caught in unstable air might rotate or tumble. However, what I saw seemed faster and more solid. It did not float gently. It rolled through the air with enough movement that I immediately thought of a falling space object. An aeroplane is possible, but difficult to match with my memory. Aircraft lights can appear large and strange through thin clouds, especially when viewed from a young child's perspective. A plane turning might seem to tumble. Bright landing lights can create a glowing mass, while colored lights on the wings produce moving points around it. If the aircraft passed low near the house, it could look enormous. But I remember visible flames, not steady lights. A plane actually on fire would have caused reports and an emergency. No such crash occurred nearby. It is more likely that clouds or moisture distorted ordinary aircraft lights into something fiery. A helicopter with a searchlight could create another unusual shape, though I would probably have heard the rotors. The object seemed silent. I do not clearly remember any sound at all. That absence may be meaningful, or it may simply be a detail my memory lost. A meteor can be silent to an observer because it is so far away, even when it looks close. Any sound may arrive much later than the light. At 5, I would not have known to wait for a delayed boom. If I ran inside immediately, I might have missed it. There is also a chance I saw smoke or cloud illuminated by light from below. A cloud moving behind the roofline could catch orange light and appear solid. The changing edges might look like flames. Wind could cause it to roll and twist. But the night sky was clear enough that I had been looking at the stars. The object had a distinct shape and path. It did not look like a cloud spreading or changing form. Childhood memory complicates everything. I was very young. Memories from that age can remain vivid while still being inaccurate in scale, timing, and detail. The object may have appeared only the size of a coin at arm's length, but over time, the memory grew to the size of a hand. It may have been much higher than I believed. The flames may have been a bright trail. The slow tumbling may have lasted only a second. Every time I told the story, the strongest details became more fixed. That does not mean I invented the event. It means the brain stores childhood experiences through emotion rather than exact measurement. The memory of being disbelieved may also have strengthened my certainty. When adults and friends dismissed me, I felt I needed to defend what I saw. I repeated the details to myself. It was huge. It was low. It was burning. It was real. That repetition may have preserved the memory while also making it more dramatic. Still, I do not believe the entire thing was imagination. I saw something in the sky. I watched it long enough to blink and check whether it remained. I ran inside because the sight was too unusual to ignore. The question is not whether I saw anything. The question is what I misunderstood about it. The apparent height is almost certainly wrong. An object only 400 or 500 feet above the ground, and as large as it seemed, would have been seen by many people. It would have produced sound, heat, debris, or damage. If it fell nearby, the impact would have been impossible to hide. Because none of that happened, the object must have been smaller, farther away, or not a physical rock at all. The night sky can remove depth. A small, bright object can seem close because the brain has nothing to compare it with. The house roof may have acted as the only reference point, making the object appear to emerge directly from behind it. In reality, it could have been far beyond the house. The same effect happens with the moon. It can look as though it sits just above a building, even though it is hundreds of thousands of miles away. My 5-year-old mind placed the object near the roof because that was where it first became visible. Its path may have crossed a huge part of the atmosphere. The rolling motion may also be an interpretation. rather than a literal observation. A meteor can pulse in brightness. Different parts of it may flare as material burns away. To a child, those changing bright areas could look like the surface turning. The object itself may have traveled smoothly while light moved around it. I described it using the closest familiar motion. It rolled. The burning wood comparison still feels accurate. The object was not simply a white streak. I remember darker areas surrounded by orange flames. If that detail is reliable, space debris may be a better explanation than a small meteor. A large piece of debris can remain visible as a dark center with glowing fragments around it. It may tumble as it falls, exposing different surfaces to intense heat. Several pieces can remain close together, giving the impression of one large object. I wish I knew the exact date. With a date, location, and time, it might be possible to check old astronomical records, news archives, or reports of satellite re-entry. Without those details, the event remains too broad. It happened in winter, around 6:30 in the evening, when I was about 5. That is not enough to identify one object from the past. I also wish my mother had come outside immediately. If an adult had seen it, I would have another description. She might have recognized a meteor, aeroplane, or firework. She could have judged the direction and speed more accurately. Instead, by the time I told her, the sighting belonged only to me. Her response, "Oh, that's nice, honey," made me feel as though I had reported something imaginary. She probably did not mean to dismiss me cruelly. Parents hear children describe impossible things all the time. A cloud becomes a dragon. A shadow becomes a person. A distant light becomes a spaceship. Most of the time, there is no reason to stop everything and investigate. But I remember wishing she had believed me enough to look. My friends' reactions made me feel worse. Children can be harsh when someone tells a story that sounds unbelievable. They probably laughed or said I was making it up. I began questioning my own mind. I wondered whether I had seen something nobody else could see. At 5 years old, not being believed can feel almost as frightening as the event itself. Adults tell you that the world works in a certain way. Rocks do not roll through the sky covered in fire. When you see something that seems to break those rules and no one confirms it, you start doubting your own senses. That confusion stayed with me longer than the fear. I do not think I witnessed anything supernatural. I do not believe a massive asteroid passed a few hundred feet above my house without anyone else noticing. The laws of physics and the lack of damage make that nearly impossible. The most likely explanation is a bright meteor or piece of space debris that looked closer and larger because I was young and had no reference point. That explanation accounts for almost everything. But knowing what it probably was does not erase what it looked like. I still remember standing outside in the cold, excited to go to my favorite restaurant. I was looking at the stars when a burning object came from behind the house. It seemed wider than my outstretched hand. It tumbled through the sky like a giant rock rolling across an invisible surface. Its body glowed like wood in a fire, with thin flames reaching from the sides. I blinked. It remained. I ran inside and told my mother. She barely reacted. For days, I searched for proof. Nothing appeared. No crash, no news story. No other child at school saying they had seen the same thing. Maybe it burned up before reaching the ground. Maybe it was hundreds of miles away. Maybe the entire event lasted only seconds and became enormous in my memory because I was 5. Those are reasonable answers. But there is still a part of me that remembers how close it looked. I expected the sky to shake. I expected something to strike the ground nearby. Instead, the object vanished, and the world continued as though nothing had happened. That was what made the experience so difficult to forget. Something that looked impossible crossed directly above my ordinary childhood evening. Then it left no evidence behind. Everyone else went on with dinner, school, and normal life, and I was left alone with the memory of a burning object rolling through the winter sky, large enough to cover my hand and close enough that I thought it might fall on us. My house is around 100 years old, which used to sound ancient to me. Looking back, I suppose it is not especially old compared with some houses, but it has been standing long enough for several generations of people to live, work, and die around it. The first family known to have lived there were blacksmiths. They kept a forge behind the house, in what is now our back garden. Nothing obvious remains above the ground. Grass covers the area, and if someone visited without knowing the history, they would never guess that people once worked metal there. The remains of the forge are still buried underneath the soil. I sometimes think about how different the property must have looked when that family lived there. The garden would have been a working area filled with smoke, heat, tools, and the sound of hammers striking iron. The house itself was apparently very bare. There was a table, a stove, and some seats, but not much else. It was not decorated or filled with comfortable furniture the way it is now. It seemed to have been used mainly as a place to eat, sleep, and recover before another day of work. I know some of this because my family ended up with old photographs of the house and the people who once lived there. My family used to own a small chain of pubs. One day, an unknown man entered one of them and approached my grandfather. The man handed him an envelope. Inside were old photographs connected to our house and the blacksmith family. This happened around 20 years after that family had moved away. Nobody knew who the man was. He did not resemble any of the people shown in the photographs, and as far as we know, he never explained how he had obtained them or why he wanted my grandfather to have them. He simply delivered the envelope. The photographs gave us a glimpse of the property as it had once been. They showed the family, the old rooms, and the simple way the house was arranged. The envelope should have been an interesting piece of local history. Instead, the mystery surrounding the man made it feel unsettling. Why had he kept the photographs for so long? How had he known that my grandfather's family was connected to the house? Why did he choose to deliver them through one of the pubs rather than sending them directly? Most importantly, who was he? No one ever found out. For years, the photographs remained part of the family's belongings. We sometimes looked at them and talked about the blacksmiths, but nothing in the images seemed openly frightening. There were no mysterious shapes in the windows or ghostly faces in the background. They were simply old pictures of people who had once called our house home. Still, living in the same rooms shown in old photographs gives a place a strange feeling. You begin noticing which walls have remained unchanged. You stand in a doorway and realize that someone stood in the same place a century earlier. The rooms are filled with modern furniture and electricity now, but underneath that, the original structure remains. For most of my life, the house did not feel constantly haunted. There were unusual sounds, but old houses make noise. Floorboards creak, pipes knock. Doors shift when the temperature changes. Wood expands and contracts. If the wind is strong, the building seems to breathe. We learn to ignore most of it. However, certain things happened often enough that my family stopped treating every sound as normal. The downstairs bathroom was one of the strangest places. When someone used it, they would sometimes hear footsteps directly outside the door. The footsteps sounded as though a person had walked into the hallway and stopped nearby. The natural response was to assume another family member was waiting to use the bathroom. You might finish, open the door, and expect to find someone standing there. The hallway would be empty. No one would admit walking past. This happened to more than one person. There were also sounds of chairs moving. A scrape would travel across the floor, as if someone had pulled out a heavy dining chair or pushed one back toward the table. Sometimes the sound came when no one was downstairs. Other times, people were in separate rooms and all heard it. When someone checked, the chairs appeared normal. It was easy to blame the floor or furniture settling. A chair leg could shift slightly on an uneven surface. A dog might bump into one. Sound could travel from a neighboring room and resemble wood scraping. We accepted those possibilities. The house had never done anything dangerous. The noises were strange, but they did not feel like a reason to leave. Then, a few months ago, something happened while I was home alone. My brother was staying at his girlfriend's house. My parents had gone to visit friends. The dogs were around, but there were no other people inside. I was upstairs watching a video on YouTube. It was an ordinary evening. I was relaxed and not thinking about the house's history, the photographs, or any of the strange sounds we sometimes heard. Then a loud banging came from downstairs. It was violent enough to make me stop the video immediately. At first, I remained still and listened. The banging was not a single object falling. There were multiple impacts. Something seemed to be crashing around in the lower part of the house. My first thought was that someone had broken in. Then I tried to calm myself. I told myself it was probably the dogs. They sometimes became excited when they wanted to go outside or come back in. They could scratch at a door, jump against something, or knock objects over. Maybe they were trying to get into the house. The explanations sounded possible, but the noise did not feel right. It was too loud. It sounded like several heavy objects being thrown rather than animals scratching or moving around. I stayed upstairs for a few moments, trying to decide whether to investigate. Part of me wanted to lock myself in the bedroom and call my parents. Another part felt ridiculous for being frightened by noise in my own house. If the dogs had caused a mess, someone would need to check whether they were injured. I paused the video and moved toward the stairs. The house had become quiet. That silence was almost worse than the banging. If the dogs were excited, I expected barking, whining, or movement. I could not hear any of that. I went downstairs carefully. As I approached the kitchen, I could already see that something was wrong. The lights in the backyard were on. We had not left them on. Their glow came through the windows and made the garden visible beyond the glass. The buried forge lay somewhere beneath that illuminated grass. Inside the kitchen, the cupboard containing the pots and pans was open. Everything that had been stored inside had been thrown around the room. Metal pots lay across the floor. Pans had landed at different angles. Some objects were near the cupboards, but others had traveled much farther, as though they had been deliberately pulled out and thrown. That was the banging I had heard. For a few seconds, I could not move. I looked for the dogs, expecting to find one of them standing among the mess. They were not responsible. There was no way they could have opened the cupboard and scattered every pot and pan like that. Even if one had managed to pull the door open, the contents would have fallen in a pile directly beneath it. They would not have been spread around the kitchen. I began thinking about a burglar again. Someone could have entered downstairs while I was watching the video and started searching through cupboards. Maybe they heard me moving upstairs and escaped before I came down. I checked the door. We had 3 locks. All of them were still secured. There was also a heavy-duty chain across the door. The chain made a distinctive rattling sound whenever the door opened or moved. It was impossible to handle quietly. The chain was still attached. The lock showed no sign of damage. No one had entered through that door. I checked the other possible entrances. Nothing appeared broken. The windows were closed. There was no shattered glass, forced lock, or obvious route someone could have used. Even if an intruder had somehow entered, they could not have left through the chained door and secured it from the inside afterward. I was still alone. I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by scattered metal and the strange light coming from the backyard. I did not want to remain downstairs. The room felt occupied, even though I could see no one. I began imagining someone standing just beyond the windows. The backyard lights had not switched themselves on for no reason. Perhaps whoever had thrown the pans was outside now, watching through the glass. I looked toward the garden. I could see the grass and parts of the property, but no person was visible. The darkness beyond the lights was too deep to search properly. Anything standing outside their reach would remain hidden. I called my family. I do not remember every word I said. I was frightened and probably speaking too quickly. I told them about the noise, the kitchen, and the locked door. They believed me. That mattered because they had experienced their own unexplained things in the house. They had heard the footsteps outside the bathroom. They knew the sound of chairs moving when no one was near them. They did not automatically assume I had knocked everything over myself or invented the incident. When they returned, we examined the kitchen more carefully. There was still no evidence of a break-in. Nothing valuable appeared to be missing. The disturbance seemed focused on the cupboard and the backyard lights. A burglar searching for money or electronics would have no reason to empty pots and pans across the kitchen. A prankster would need access to the house and a way to leave without touching the locks or chain. No one outside the family should have had that access. One possibility is that the cupboard failed. If a shelf collapsed, the pots and pans could fall suddenly and create a series of loud impacts. The cupboard door might open under the pressure, allowing everything inside to spill onto the floor. Metal objects can bounce and roll farther than expected, especially when they strike one another. That could make a simple collapse look violent. This is one of the most reasonable explanations. The house is old. Shelves weaken. Screws loosen. Wood warps. A cupboard that appears stable can fail without warning. But I do not remember seeing a broken shelf. Nothing obvious inside the cupboard explained why the contents had come out. The pans also seemed too widely spread. A collapse should have created a concentrated pile near the cupboard. Instead, the kitchen looked as though someone had taken each item and thrown it in a different direction. The dogs are another possible explanation. One of them may have entered the kitchen, smelled food inside the cupboard, and pushed at the door. Once the pots began falling, the animal could have panicked and run through the room, kicking or scattering them farther. That might explain the wide distribution. The noise could have frightened the dogs enough that they left the area before I arrived. However, the cupboard was not an easy one for them to open. There was also no food stored inside that would normally attract them. None of the dogs appeared injured or especially frightened afterward. The backyard lights might have been unrelated. Someone could have switched them on earlier and forgotten. I might not have noticed until the kitchen incident made me more alert. A timer, sensor, wiring problem, or brief electrical fault could also activate them. Old electrical systems behave unpredictably. The coincidence of the lights in the pots made the event feel deliberate, but they may have had separate causes. Perhaps a power surge affected the lights and caused an appliance or vibration that disturbed the cupboard. A heavy vehicle passing nearby could shake an old house enough to move unstable objects. I do not remember feeling the building shake, but the metal crashing would have covered smaller sounds. There may also have been an animal larger than our pets. A rat, fox, or other creature could enter through a gap too small for a person. It might climb into a cupboard, become trapped, and cause chaos while escaping. An animal moving among pots would create loud banging. By the time I reached the kitchen, it could have disappeared through the same opening. but we found no droppings, fur, damaged packaging, or hole. An animal powerful enough to throw heavy pans around should have left some evidence. The locked room aspect is what makes the event difficult. Something physical happened. The pots and pans moved. The lights came on. There was no question of a dream or hallucination because the mess remained after my family returned. The cause had to be inside the house, or part of the house itself. Yet no person should have been able to enter or leave. I began thinking about the footsteps and moving chairs differently after that. Before, they were only sounds. Sounds can be misidentified. The kitchen incident involved visible movement. If the same thing that caused the footsteps had become stronger, perhaps it was now capable of moving objects. That is the frightening interpretation. The house's history naturally entered my thoughts, too. The first family had worked with metal. The forge behind the house would have been filled with iron tools, pots, chains, and the repeated sound of hammering. Now, a century later, metal objects had been violently thrown around our kitchen while the lights above the old forge site came on. It is easy to create a supernatural connection from those details. Perhaps something connected to the blacksmith family remained on the property. Maybe the buried forge still mattered to whoever had lived there. The pots and pans could represent metalwork. The banging might echo the hammering that once happened outside. But that is only a story created after the event. There is no proof the blacksmiths experienced tragedy in the house or that any of them died there. We do not know whether they believed the property was haunted. Old photographs do not automatically imply ghosts. The mysterious man who delivered them may also have had an ordinary explanation. He could have been a collector, local historian, distant relative, or former neighbor. Perhaps he found the envelope while clearing another property and traced the house to my family. He may have been shy, in a hurry, or unwilling to explain his connection. The fact that he did not resemble the people in the pictures means very little. He could have been born decades later. Still, the lack of identity makes the photographs feel as though the house itself arranged for them to return. They were separated from the property for 20 years, then carried into one of my family's pubs by someone no one recognized. Now they remain with us, documenting the first people who occupied the rooms. Sometimes I wonder whether the man had experienced something connected to the house. Maybe he wanted to remove the photographs from his possession. Perhaps he believed they belonged with the current owners. There is no way to know. My family never saw him again. The bathroom footsteps continue to bother me because they sound so ordinary. They are not dramatic chains, voices, or screams. They sound like a person walking past a closed door. That is exactly what makes them convincing. When you hear them, you do not initially think ghost. You think a family member is outside. Only after opening the door and finding no one do you question it. The same is true of the chairs. A scraping chair is a familiar household sound. The mind recognizes it immediately. When no one is in the room, the explanation becomes uncertain. Maybe the sounds traveled from neighbors or outside. Houses carry noise through pipes, floors, and walls. A chair moving in another part of the building might seem to be directly below you. The footsteps could come from someone upstairs, reflected through the structure. But our house is detached enough that not every sound can be blamed on neighbors. Multiple family members have heard the same things over time. That shared experience is why they believed me about the kitchen. They already knew the house could produce sounds without an obvious source. The kitchen incident changed my behavior. I no longer stay home alone. Even when I know the most likely cause was structural, mechanical, or animal, I cannot relax by myself in the house. Every noise brings back the sight of the scattered pans. If a chair scrapes downstairs, I wonder whether I will find the furniture moved. If footsteps stop outside the bathroom, I imagine the handle turning. If the backyard lights come on unexpectedly, I look toward the place where the old forge is buried. The fear is not constant when other people are home. Another person changes the atmosphere. There is someone to confirm a sound, help search, or call for assistance. Alone, every unexplained noise becomes something I have to face without knowing whether the cause is human, structural, or something else. I have considered setting up cameras. A camera in the kitchen or hallway could capture future movement. If a cupboard fails, the footage would show it. If a dog causes the disturbance, we would know. If someone has a hidden way into the house, a camera might reveal them. The idea is practical, but it also frightens me. Part of me does not want to see what happens in the rooms when no one is there. An empty chair moving would be worse on video than in memory. A figure crossing the hallway would change how I felt about the house permanently. Even footage showing nothing might not help. If objects moved outside the camera's view, the uncertainty would remain. I also wonder whether disturbing the buried forge would explain anything. Archaeologists or historians might be able to locate its foundations and tell us more about the family. There could be old tools, metal fragments, or records connected to the property. But digging into the garden only because of a frightening incident seems unwise. The forge is part of the house's history, not necessarily the source of its sounds. Removing or exposing it would not guarantee answers. It might only create more stories. A professional inspection of the cupboards, electrical system, locks, and building structure would probably be more useful. If the shelf was unstable, it could be repaired. If wiring caused the lights to activate, that could be fixed. If gaps allowed animals inside, they could be sealed. Normal explanations should be investigated before anything paranormal is assumed. I believe that. But belief becomes harder when you are the person standing in the kitchen. The door remains chained. The locks are intact. Metal is scattered across the floor. Lights illuminate an empty garden. In that moment, practical explanations do not arrive quickly enough. The first thought is that someone is inside with you. I searched the visible rooms, but never felt certain the house was empty. There are corners, cupboards, and spaces where a person might hide briefly. I did not perform a complete search. I was too frightened. If a burglar had somehow entered, confronting them alone would have been dangerous. I probably should have left immediately and called someone from outside. Instead, I remained long enough to check the locks and understand the scene. Nothing confronted me. No footsteps ran upstairs. No door opened. The house was silent after the crash. That silence gave the incident the feeling of being finished before I arrived. Whatever caused it had already done what it wanted. Sometimes I imagine the pots moving one at a time, a cupboard door opening slowly, a pan lifting or being pulled out, metal striking the floor. Another following, the noise continuing while I sat upstairs watching a video, unaware of what was happening below. Then, the backyard lights switching on. By the time I reached the kitchen, nothing remained except the arrangement. That image may not reflect reality. A shelf probably collapsed in only a few seconds. The lights may have already been on. Fear turns a mechanical accident into an intentional sequence. But the idea of intention is hard to remove. The objects were not broken for value. They were not stolen. They were displayed across the kitchen. The disturbance seemed designed to be heard. I think that is why I stopped staying alone. The incident felt less like random activity and more like an announcement. The house had made small noises for years. Footsteps, chairs scraping. Things that could be ignored. Then, when no one else was home, it created a crash loud enough to bring me downstairs. I do not claim that a ghost threw the pans. I cannot prove anything supernatural happened. The most likely explanation remains a failed shelf, an animal, or some combination of ordinary events. The building is old enough for unexpected damage. The dogs may have contributed. The lights may have activated independently. Several coincidences can occur at the same time without having a single cause. But the security of the house was real. The chain was still attached. The locks were intact. No burglar could easily have entered, rearranged the kitchen, turned on the garden lights, and left everything secured from inside. Someone with a duplicate key still could not fasten the chain after leaving. That fact prevents me from accepting a human intruder unless there was another route we never found. The recurring footsteps and chair noises make the structural explanation feel incomplete too. Maybe all old houses produce similar sounds. Maybe ours only seems unusual because we know the blacksmith history and possess the photographs. Expectation shapes experience. A family living in a new house might call the same noise plumbing. We call it footsteps because the house already feels connected to previous lives. That is possible. Even so, the pots were not a sound open to interpretation. They had moved. The room changed physically. My family saw the aftermath. I did not imagine it. I sometimes look at the photographs of the first family and search their faces for some clue. They stand or sit around the bare house they once knew. The rooms behind them are recognizable, but incomplete. There are no modern cupboards filled with cookware, no electric garden lights, no television upstairs. Outside, the forge had not yet disappeared beneath the grass. I wonder how many sounds they heard at night. Did footsteps pass outside their rooms? Did chairs scrape when no one was sitting at the table? Did they ever find tools moved from where they had left them? Maybe the house behaved strangely even then. Maybe they were the source of the stories rather than victims of them. Or perhaps they lived ordinary lives, and nothing unusual began until long after they left. The unknown man who returned their photographs remains part of the mystery. He connected our family to people we had never met. Without him, we would know much less about the house. Maybe he was simply preserving history. Maybe he had a personal reason for not giving his name. There is no reason to connect him to the kitchen incident, yet my mind always does. Both events involve something entering our family's life without a clear route. An envelope appears through a stranger. Years later, the contents of a locked house are thrown around while no one is downstairs. Neither event provides enough information to understand why it happened. Since that night, nothing equally violent has occurred. The footsteps still happen occasionally. The sounds of moving chairs have not completely stopped. The house continues aging around us. That absence of escalation is reassuring. If something intended to harm us, it has had many opportunities. No one has been attacked. No object has been thrown at a person. The disturbances remain focused on sounds and movement. Perhaps the kitchen event was only the loudest mechanical failure the house has produced. I hope so. But I still refuse to stay alone. When everyone leaves, the rooms seem different. The silence feels watchful. I become aware of the downstairs bathroom, the hallway, and the kitchen cupboard. I imagine the chain on the door rattling even when it does not move. I look through the windows at the back garden and think about the forge hidden under the grass. A century ago, the sound of metal striking metal would have been normal there. Now, the property is quiet. Maybe old houses remember the kinds of sounds they were built around. That is not a scientific idea, but it is the closest description I have for how the place feels. The building contains layers of routine. People sat at tables, moved chairs, walked through hallways, and worked with metal. The people disappeared, but sometimes the sounds seem to repeat. Most likely, the explanation lies in old wood, pipes, animals, faulty fixtures, and human imagination. I know that. Still, I cannot forget coming downstairs alone and seeing every pot and pan thrown across the kitchen. The garden lights were on. The locks were secure. The heavy chain had not moved. No one was there. And somewhere beneath the illuminated grass, the remains of the old blacksmith's forge were still buried exactly where they had been for 100 years.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.